How much is an issue is Chinese espionage?
It is becoming a larger and larger issue. The Chinese state, through the Ministry of State Security, the MSS, is becoming much more assertive, much more active.
James Bond movies, MI5 and MI6 were as exalted as the leaders in spy and espionage. Do they still hold that reputation?
James Bond is the best recruiting tool British intelligence have ever had. They don't conduct those sort of kinetic operations where they go out with a license to kill. MI6 officers have never had a license to kill.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. Information gathering and influence operations have been part of statecraft since organized states first appeared in history. Now, countries around the world, both big and small, engage in it, but there is one whose actions have been making world populations increasingly nervous due to the opaque and undemocratic nature of its government, China. So, to discuss modern-day espionage and how spying has become an integral part of China's geopolitical strategy, we welcome Paul McGarr. He's a lecturer in intelligence studies at King's College London. He's also the author of the book Spying in South Asia, Britain, and the United States and India's Secret Cold War. This was published just this September. Thank you very much for being on the program. I wanted to start with the title of your book. You mentioned Britain, US, and India on the cover, but where's China?
So it is a transnational history, and China features largely in the book principally because it's one of India's principal adversaries during that period. So China does feature, but the book is really about American and British interaction with Indian intelligence, although China is a major player in that equation. So, for example, the 1962 border war sees China loom large in India's strategic thinking after a period of relative good relations between Beijing and New Delhi. They sour in the late 1950s, and obviously a border conflict ensues in 1962, and that really sends their relationship into freefall. At that point, China does become the most dominant sort of narrative in India's security relationship regionally and globally. And the United States and the United Kingdom really lend huge amounts of support to China during the 1960s, particularly to offset sort of preponderance of Chinese power and a notion that China's threatening to be expansionist within South Asia. So China is a feature of the book, but the book really is about how those two powers, those two Western powers, interact and help India in its battle against China.
Now, one of the most prominent spying incidents in the region in the 1950s was the bombing and then the subsequent crash of the Air India aircraft called Kashmir Princess, which took place over the South China Sea. And at the time, Hong Kong police conducted an investigation and put the blame on the Kuomintang, which later ruled Taiwan. So does Taiwan feature in this anthology or in this book?
It does, and the Kashmir Princess incident, as you mentioned, in the mid-1950s, is a crucial incident really in international relations generally. Comes on the back of the Bandung Conference, the first sort of major meeting of non-aligned countries in Southeast Asia and Indonesia. And the Kashmir Princess, because it's an Indian plane, and therefore India is really involved in the security investigation that results after that plane is lost in the sea over Indonesia. The bomb goes off in the plane, and there is a contentious sort of debate over who's responsible for placing that bomb. But the Indian security and intelligence services play a very big role in that. Someone called R.N. Kao, who's at that time a member of the Indian Intelligence Bureau, but goes on to be the first head of India's external intelligence service, the Research and Analysis Wing, which is formed in 1968. Kao is a leading figure in Indian intelligence already by the 1950s. And Jawaharlal Nehru, the Indian Prime Minister at the time, gives Kao responsibility from an Indian perspective of investigating what happened regarding the Kashmir Princess. So Kao travels to Hong Kong. He meets with British colonial police in Hong Kong. He travels to Beijing. He meets with Zhou Enlai in Beijing and tries to get the Chinese perspective on this. So someone who spends a lot of time sort of rooting through what happened and eventually files a report back to Jawaharlal Nehru, which is actually sort of partly available in the Nehru Library in New Delhi. So even today, some interesting new files are beginning to come out on that incident from an Indian perspective. It's
all the makings of a plot of a movie. Let's bring it forward to present day. Earlier in May, the then UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, revealed a quote-unquote malign actor had compromised British military payroll records, with reports pointing the finger to China. Now, in April, UK parliamentary researcher and another man were charged with spying for China for allegedly providing information which could be, quote, again, useful to an enemy. Now, are all of these isolated incidents, and the reason is I'm trying to get the bigger picture here, how much is an issue is Chinese espionage, let's say, in the UK now?
It is becoming a larger and larger issue. I think we're moving on for a period, say, from around 2010, when David Cameron's coalition government and later Conservative government inaugurated a so-called golden era with China. And that was very much based on the United Kingdom's economic needs at the time and a sort of a willingness with Whitehall to sort of brush aside some security concerns related to China in pursuit of an economic relationship that would benefit the United Kingdom. So trade and economics really dominated the United Kingdom's relationship with China from about 2010 through to about 2016. Then we had a new government, a new Conservative government in the United Kingdom under Theresa May. And Theresa May's government really from 2016 became much more concerned with what they regarded as increasing moves by the Chinese state to penetrate Britain, particularly around trade secrets and industrial espionage and hacking, but also about influence operations, both against British MPs in the British Parliament, but also against Chinese nationals in the United Kingdom as well, particularly those studying at UK universities. So there is, I think, been a shift in the UK sort of security dynamic, really, to become much more sceptical and much more assertive in challenging what it regards as increasing Chinese espionage targeted against the United Kingdom.
I do want to talk about the surveillance of Chinese nationals overseas, but I want to go back to this idea of the issue of Chinese infiltration or espionage in the trade sector, given that, the economy is always held up as a priority. And in that sense, is often, or is there almost perhaps even ignoring certain threats that China poses in the name of business or economy or trade? And how much of a compromise is that?
I think there has been a recent parliamentary inquiry in the United Kingdom on this very question, and I think that parliamentary inquiry has been quite clear in stating that the balance between trade and economics and security perhaps was compromised during the early part of the 2010s through to mid 2015, 2016. So there's quite a lot of criticism within that parliamentary report about the fact that the United Kingdom government perhaps turned a blind eye to what the Chinese were doing in the United Kingdom in pursuit of trade. So really the report is essentially saying that George Osborne, the UK Chancellor at the time, and the British Treasury were driving a British security policy towards China, and therefore they were sort of ignoring or at least taking a sort of a benign sort of approach to a lot of Chinese activity in the United Kingdom. That has changed over the last decade or so, and the United Kingdom has become much more assertive and much more concerned about Chinese espionage, and particularly industrial espionage, not only hacking and cyber espionage, but also physical attempts to try and infiltrate research establishments in the United Kingdom, particularly through universities, but also commercially as well. So I think there has been a significant shift, and I think the United Kingdom has come to realise, having conducted quite a thorough investigation into its relationship with China, that perhaps that balance between trade and security was wrong in the first half of the 2010s, and now it's much more sort of aligned to protect Britain's commercial assets and commercial sort of secrets.
How much has the rest of Europe woken up to that? There was 3 German citizens were arrested in April under the suspicion of attempted transfer of information and sensitive technology to China. There was a parliamentarian in Germany also who was suspected of providing information or having exchanges with China at the expense of the nation. How much is Europe now realizing that this isn't just about exchanges and creating business deals and, economic partnership, that there is a far more sinister issue at the heart of this?
I think Europe is beginning to take a much more active and engaged approach in terms of its security relationship with the People's Republic of China. So the German example you mentioned, I think, was interesting. 3 Germans arrested in April for spying allegedly for the Chinese Ministry of State Security, the MSS. And that was really around trying to get access to engine designs for combat ships that the Germans were developing during that period. So industrial espionage with a military component attached to it. And I think that has led to debates in Germany and across Europe, really, particularly within the European Commission, over what more can be done to protect Europe commercially and politically from sort of activity from the Chinese state, really. So I think the European Commission particularly has spoke to lots of research institutes throughout Europe. It's created a research advisory hub for the first time to advise those research institutes who are dealing with commercially and militarily sensitive information and technology about how they can best protect themselves from external actors such as the People's Republic of China, but also from Russia, for example. Risk assessments are now being sort of calibrated in the European Union. So much more sort of attention paid on how those companies are managing their own security. There's security and training and screening now provided by the European Union. And that sort of relationship, I think, between pan-European, cross-European intelligence and security services and commercial elements within those countries in Europe, and also European universities, is getting closer and closer. I mean, for the first time, European intelligence services are stationing liaison officers in European universities, for example, to advise them on security and how to protect the research they're conducting. So there has been a sea change and a big shift, really, in the European Union waking up to this espionage that's taking place and trying to proactively put in place counter-espionage mechanisms that will make it much more difficult for external states, whether it be China or Russia, to acquire those secrets from the European Union.
But how much would you say that is filtering down on a business level with corporations? And I'm saying, across Europe and in the UK, where growth often means, and especially if you want global growth, looking to China and making those deals and tapping their markets.
Yeah, I think there is, as we mentioned before, there's a real balance there between a drive for growth and a drive for profit. Lots of these companies are commercial entities, of course, and they're looking to maximize their profits for their shareholders, and state security when they're dealing with information, whether it be related to military technology or commercially sensitive information, that's going to really compromise the overall welfare of its nation state if it gets into the wrong hands, either into China's hands or to Russia's hands. So I think that sort of balance is something that national governments now becoming increasingly concerned by. And of course, they're always trying to encourage commercial entities to take a wider perspective rather than just their profits, to think about national security in a broader context, really. That's an ongoing discussion, I think, and it's going to take some time to get commercial companies to shift from the so-called golden era of Chinese relations, when they were reaching out to Beijing and trying to get as many contracts with Chinese companies as they possibly could, to a more sort of sober approach to China, and recognizing that sort of relationship, that economic relationship, often comes with a security cost. So I think it's an ongoing process of education that is beginning to gain traction, but is still going to take some time.
Okay, let's talk about spying in the UK. Back in the day, James Bond movies, MI5 and MI6 were as exalted as the leaders in spy and espionage. Do they still hold that reputation, or especially given the sophistication we're now seeing how China infiltrates various institutions?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, I think British intelligence has often been sort of framed around popular culture, and particularly James Bond films and the James Bond novels of Ian Fleming. MI5, the British Domestic Security Service, and MI6, or SIS, the British Foreign Intelligence Service, have always been relatively small. They're relatively small operations when you compare them to the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States, or to the FSB and SVR in Russia, or even to the MSS in China. These are relatively small-scale operations that Britain is conducting through its intelligence and security services. So in terms of scale and in terms of global reach, Britain certainly doesn't compete on the same sort of level, and never has done really, with the Central Intelligence Agency or the Cold War Soviet KGB, or now the FSB and the GRU. But I think that James Bond narrative has always been really useful for British intelligence. And interestingly, the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, have been careful to cultivate that narrative and to encourage it. So they welcome James Bond films, and they sort of, they're a recruiting tool really for British intelligence, and give it that sort of that edge. I mean, one former director or chief of SIS, the British Secret Intelligence Service, said James Bond is the best recruiting tool British intelligence have ever had. So they are conscious of that image and willing to exploit it for their own purposes if they possibly can. But I think Britain's, in terms of its sort of practical intelligence reach, has always been a minor partner in its relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency, for example.
Right, and you know, speaking of kind of changing, like kind of an evolving environment, what we're also seeing is, and I think this is a problem for the UK too, is a lot of dissidents or people trying to get away from China's persecutions and crackdowns end up in countries that grant them asylum or grant them, you know, particularly what we've seen with Hong Kong too, and that also then in turn makes China extend its reach, or China tries to extend its reach. And you mentioned this earlier, in trying to track them and trying to survey these dissidents. And does that make then, in that case, places like the UK or Germany or parts of the US, which open their doors, more of a target for China's surveillance or spying?
Yeah, I think there is a consensus in North America, in the United States particularly, but also in Canada and across Europe and the United Kingdom, that this is an increasing problem. So the Chinese state, through the Ministry of State Security, the MSS, is becoming much more assertive, much more active in trying to crack down on Chinese dissidents living abroad. This is often through Chinese consuls or so-called Chinese pseudo police stations that the Chinese state has established regionally. So there's one in Glasgow, for example, in the United Kingdom, was one in Glasgow, one in Birmingham, one in London. So these notions of Chinese outstations away from the Chinese embassy, which some have claimed, or human rights groups have claimed, have been used by the Chinese state to put pressure on Chinese dissidents to visit them, to put pressure on them via cyber operations as well, has been quite a sort of pernicious activity, really, that I think lots of North American and European governments are increasingly concerned about. So the United States State Department, for example, has spoken out about this and has investigated claims that China is using those consuls across North America for means that other than the which they were intended, i.e. to crack down on Chinese dissidents.
Is this something that only China does, or do we see other countries do this? Do you feel that this is a very China-centric approach or operation?
I think other countries do it and have done it in the past. I think China has always had a very large diaspora, both not only in Southeast Asia but in North America and Europe. So it's in terms of novelty, I don't think this is particularly confined to China. But in terms of scale, certainly China, I think, sets itself apart from other nation states in that because of the reach of the Chinese diaspora, that I think most sort of North American and European states are really concerned about what China is doing particularly. Russia has also been involved in sort of activity in the past, particularly Russian dissidents during the Cold War and Eastern Europe dissidents during the Cold War have sort of had experienced sort of similar types of harassment and intimidation and coercion, but nothing, I think, on the scale of China. So if we're talking about scale, I think China is the primary concern for governments in North America and Europe.
What about intellectual property? How much concern is there, and are we seeing policies being made with regards to protecting intellectual property, whereas before there was a lot of encouragement in sharing of knowledge with China and technologies? Where is that now, particularly in the UK?
Yeah, I think there is concern that in the past there have been lots of bilateral sort of technology agreements, and particularly around the growth of artificial intelligence and AI and the intellectual property concerning those sort of cutting edge developments, which are likely to potentially could transform the way we work and we live and the way industry conducts its business moving forward in the near future. So I think there is some concern that China, working in partnership with Chinese companies, offers tremendous benefits. It offers access to ready capital and cash. It offers some technological expertise as well that certain UK companies don't have. It offers access potentially to a huge Chinese market, which has always been a sort of something that British companies have coveted, really. So there are lots of advantages of working with China from a commercial perspective. But I think the security implications of working with Chinese companies, particularly Chinese companies that have very strong links or connections with the sort of military-industrial complex in China. So with the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, or with the MSS, those companies that have those sort of connections, I think the UK government is very wary about those. So the UK government is much more active in trying to educate commercial companies about intellectual property and the sort of the pitfalls or the risks of working in collaboration with Chinese companies, particularly those that have very close relationships with the PLA or the MSS.
You mentioned the MSS, the Ministry of State Security, that's China's intelligence body. It's been described as a combination of FBI and CIA. Well, what do we know about how they work and how they operate?
Well, not as much as we'd like is the answer to that question, I think. It is a very secret organisation. So you're absolutely right. It does control external intelligence operations, but it also controls internal intelligence operations, along with the PLA within China itself. So cracking down on dissidents, any sort of opposition to the Chinese Communist Party domestically. The MSS we know relatively little about compared to, for example, the Russian FSB or the SVR or GRU, Russian military intelligence. It is something of a sort of hidden entity, really. We do know that it's very active. It has outstations across Southeast Asia and North America and Europe. So it's an intelligence agency that is becoming much more active. In the past, it's been focused really on sort of Chinese regional neighborhood and China itself. But it's becoming, as China really steps onto the stage as a global power, and particularly as its relationship with the United States gets tenser and tenser over what's happening in East Asia and South China Sea, I think the MSS is becoming much more assertive. But we do, in answer to your question, we do need to know more about it. It's very difficult to penetrate the MSS and to find out sufficient data really to enable us to get a strong analysis on its leadership and what's motivating its actions.
Now, your book talks also, as we said in the past, of how India has had to fend off or track Chinese espionage or other kinds of surveillance. How do you see India now managing the spying relationship with China, the espionage that's coming from China, and its own spying that it conducts, of course, for its own national security or own interests?
Yeah, it's always been an interesting relationship. So India has always been really, it's been an asymmetric relationship in terms of intelligence and security, I think. And by that, I mean India's historically had quite a large Chinese diaspora population, particularly in eastern India, centered around Calcutta. And so India's always been concerned that because of that diasporic population of Chinese nationals within India, that China's always had an intelligence advantage, that it can tap into those nationals, ask them to spy on what's happening in India, give information back to Beijing, for example, either willingly because of ideological reasons or because those Chinese individuals living in India are being coerced by the Chinese state to do so. So there's always been a concern about the reach of the Chinese state inside India. Very difficult for India to operate in China. There isn't the same Indian diasporic population in China. So India's always found it very difficult to operate within China. And the other benefit China has is that India is a democracy, free movement of people, there's a free press. It's much easier for Chinese nationals and other agents of the Chinese state to move around India and acquire information openly. Very difficult for India to run agents inside China, given the totalitarian, authoritarian nature of the Chinese state and the extensive use of surveillance within China as well as technology's grown. So there's an asymmetrical, I think, difference in that relationship, in that India's been far more concerned about what China's doing, and China really has been able to control and limit the extent to which India is able to penetrate the Chinese state and observe what China's doing. So there is a sort of concern, I think, on the part of New Delhi that its intelligence really isn't good enough on China.
And how would you say technology has complicated all of this with social media, being able to kind of monitor people through their communications now? Has it kind of evened the playing field to a certain extent, or perhaps not, because China has this massive firewall?
Yeah, China has a firewall, so it's very difficult for external intelligence services, or more difficult for external intelligence services to penetrate the Chinese state and to find out what Chinese people are doing. Also, operating in China is much more difficult. I mean, India is absolutely embracing technological revolution, but not on the same scale or at the same pace as China. So, lots of commentary about how China now has become a surveillance state, so that every individual in China, wherever they go, they're being filmed on CCTV, their biometrics are being recorded whenever they purchase anything or move into a shop or public space. So this notion that China is becoming a state in which every individual's activities are always monitored 24 hours a day is very much sort of driving in the security narrative inside China. That isn't really happening in India in the same way. India has a very different culture, a very different society. It's a democracy. It hasn't evolved to the same technological standards. And I think that be much more pushback from many Indians around this notion of surveillance and how pervasive state surveillance should be at any point within India.
So if you had to make a movie on espionage, what would you say the modern day spy looks like now? Would it still be that suave guy in the well-fitted suit with a martini, or is it someone who knows really how to code sitting behind a computer?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think the latest James Bond movies have very much sort of embraced that narrative. So we still have, for example, Daniel Craig, that rugged, sort of macho type SIS MI6 officer who's very much a stereotype. But in the background, you have sort of Q, the sort of quartermaster for MI6, who I think in one scene says to Bond, I can do more damage on my laptop sitting at home having a cup of tea in the morning than you can do in several weeks out in the field in sort of traditional human intelligence. So I think there is even cultural production or popular culture now is beginning to sort of a wink at what's going on in terms of technological change and how that's changing the intelligence landscape. I think, of course, MI6 agents have never really been the James Bond type. They tend to be much more sober, erudite individuals. They don't conduct those sort of kinetic operations where they go out with a license to kill. MI6 officers have never had a license to kill. And when the British state does engage in those operations, it's conducted in sort of collaboration with British special forces. So if those operations are to be conducted and they are kinetic and they might involve the use of violence, then it tends to be the British SAS, Special Air Service, or Special Boat Squadron, SBS, who offer the special forces expertise to conduct those sort of military type operations, with MI6 being very much the analytical people in the background, the espionage agency, gatherers of intelligence, and the people that analyse that intelligence. So that sort of popular narrative of a one-stop shop intelligence agent who does everything is never really held true. But it's interesting the way popular culture, I think, is beginning to sort of engage with that narrative for the first time, really.
It's going to be very difficult to make an exciting trailer for what you just described as the modern day spy. But this has been an incredibly interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Paul McGarr, lecturer in intelligence studies at King's College London, for joining us on the show. And for our viewers everywhere, it has been good to have your company. If you enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, do join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.